April 29th, 1945, a Sunday morning. The sky over Bavaria is a dull, slate grey, and the air carries a biting chill that cuts through the uniforms of the advancing American troops. The men of the US 45th Infantry Division are pushing toward a large complex just outside of Munich. They believe they are approaching a supply depot, or perhaps a large factory. They are cautious, weapons drawn, scanning the perimeter for snipers. They have no idea that they are walking into the nightmare of the century. The first thing they notice isn't the enemy, it isn't the barbed wire. It is the silence. A heavy, unnatural silence that hangs over the railroad tracks leading into the complex. And then the smell hits them. It is a thick, cloying stench of decay that cuts through the crisp spring air, a smell so overpowering that it forces hardened combat veterans to cover their faces with handkerchiefs. Sitting motionless on the tracks is a train, 39 cattle cars, rusted and silent. A young lieutenant signals his men to approach. The gravel crunches loudly under their boots as they move toward the lead car. The silence is deafening. With a gloved hand, a soldier unlatches the heavy iron door of the first car and slides it open. The sound of metal grinding on metal echoes through the morning mist. He looks inside, and for a moment, his brain refuses to process what his eyes are seeing. Inside the car are bodies, thousands of them, men, women, and children, stacked on top of each other like firewood. They are tangled in a macabre embrace of death, limbs intertwined, eyes staring vacantly at the open door. These are not soldiers killed in battle. These are skeletons wrapped in skin, stripped of their dignity, their humanity, and finally, their lives. As the Americans move down the line, opening car after car, the scale of the atrocity becomes impossible to comprehend. But to understand why these soldiers are about to lose their minds, we have to understand the story behind this train. These victims didn't just appear here. They were passengers on a 3-week journey from hell. This train had originated nearly 200 miles away at the Buchenwald concentration camp. As the Allied forces closed in, the Nazis began a frantic evacuation. They crammed thousands of prisoners into these metal boxes for a journey that was supposed to take 24 hours. Instead, due to Allied airstrikes and damaged rails, it took 21 days. 21 days without food. 21 days without water. As the Americans examine the bodies, they notice details that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. They see claw marks on the wooden walls of the cars where prisoners had tried to scratch their way out. They see the evidence of pure, primal desperation. In the corner of one car, the bodies bear jagged bite marks. The soldiers realize with horror that as the starvation set in, the living had been forced to consume the flesh of the dead just to survive another hour. Of the roughly 5,000 people shoved onto this train at Buchenwald, nearly half are dead on arrival. The rest are barely clinging to existence, too weak to even cry out for help. Now, shift your focus from the dead to the men looking at them. It is crucial to understand who is standing on that railroad track. These aren't fresh-faced recruits who just stepped off the boat. These are the Thunderbirds, the men of the 45th Infantry Division. They are a National Guard unit from Oklahoma, Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico. Many of them are Native Americans, possessing a warrior heritage that runs deep in their blood. These men are tired. They are suffering from what we would now call severe combat fatigue. They have been fighting for over 500 days. They fought their way through the bloody beaches of Sicily, slogged up the Italian peninsula, invaded southern France, and breached the German border. They have endured freezing winters in foxholes. They have killed, and they have watched men die. They are professional soldiers who thought they had seen everything war could possibly throw at them. But nothing in those 500 days prepared them for the 39 cattle cars of Dachau. You can see the transformation happening in real time. A 19-year-old private from Oklahoma, a boy who had stormed machine gun nests without flinching, sits down in the snow and begins to weep uncontrollably. Another veteran soldier, a man who has likely killed enemy troops in close quarters, doubles over and vomits until there is nothing left in his stomach. But as the initial shock wears off, the tears begin to dry, and in the vacuum left by the sadness, something else rushes in. A cold, shaking, murderous rage. For months, rumors had been circulating through the American ranks about the Malmedy massacre, where SS troops had gunned down American prisoners of war during the Battle of the Bulge. Until today, that was just a story, a rumor. But looking at the skeletal remains in these boxcars, The soldiers of the 45th realized that the stories were not only true, but they were also an understatement. They realized that the people who did this, the SS guards who locked these doors and let these children starve, are not soldiers. They are not an enemy army entitled to the protections of the Geneva Convention. In the eyes of the Thunderbirds, the SS have forfeited their right to exist. The lieutenant colonel on the ground, Felix Sparks, tries to maintain order. He shouts at his men to keep moving, to get away from the train. "Don't look at it," he yells. "Just keep moving." But you cannot not look. The image of the death train burns itself into their retinas. It rewires their moral compass. Leaving the railroad tracks behind, the soldiers of the 45th Infantry Division cross the narrow bridge over the Amper River and approach the main entrance of the complex. The air here is heavy, vibrating with an eerie mix of dread and anticipation. They reach the iron gate, woven into which is the infamous phrase, "Arbeit macht frei," work sets you free. To the Americans standing there, fresh from the sights of the boxcars, the slogan is a sick joke, a final insult from a regime that had industrialized murder. The camp is not entirely secure. As the Americans move along the perimeter, the tension is palpable. Every shadow looks like an ambush. Every movement in a window looks like a sniper. At one of the guard towers, Tower B, a few SS guards are spotted attempting to descend. There is no shout for surrender, no warning shot. The American response is immediate and lethal. A volley of rifle fire erupts, knocking the guards off the ladder and sending them plunging into the moat below. The soldiers then walk to the edge of the water and empty their magazines into the floating bodies. It is a clear message. The time for hesitation is over. But the true breaking point, the moment that seals the fate of the remaining guards, happens when the camp's acting commandant makes his appearance. With the camp commandant Martin Weiss having fled days earlier, the command has fallen to a young SS Obersturmführer named Heinrich Wicker. Wicker is 23 years old. He knows the war is lost. He knows the Americans are at the gate. But Heinrich Wicker makes a calculation that reveals just how disconnected he is from reality. He believes that if he follows the standard military protocol, he will be treated as an officer and a gentleman. So, Wicker prepares for his big moment. He puts on his finest dress uniform. He polishes his tall black boots until they gleam like mirrors. He ensures his collar is stiff and his insignia is perfectly aligned. He lightly shaves and applies cologne. He gathers a small entourage and walks out toward the American lines carrying a white flag, projecting an air of arrogant professionalism. He expects a salute. He expects a formal exchange of pleasantries. He expects to hand over the camp and be escorted to a comfortable officers' holding area. What Wicker doesn't understand is that the men he is walking toward have just spent 30 minutes looking at the death train. The confrontation is jarring. On one side, you have the American GIs, filthy, unshaven, covered in mud and the grime of battle, their eyes hollowed out by the horrors of the last hour. On the other side stands Heinrich Wicker, immaculate, smelling of soap and leather, looking like he just stepped out of a propaganda poster. This visual contrast acts as a psychological detonator. To the Americans, Wicker's cleanliness is an obscenity. It is proof that while the people in the boxcars were eating their own dead to survive, this man was sleeping in a warm bed, eating hot meals, and polishing his boots. His pristine appearance isn't a sign of discipline. It is a confession of his complicity. It highlights the grotesque inequality between the murderers and the victims. An American officer steps forward to meet him. Wicker begins his rehearsed speech, surrendering the camp to the United States Army. He waits for the reciprocal respect due to his rank. Instead, the American officer looks at the clean, well-fed Nazi, then looks past him toward the piles of emaciated corpses rotting in the sun just yards away. The officer doesn't salute. He spits in the German's face. The illusion of a gentleman's war shatters instantly. Wicker is shoved, struck with the butt of a rifle, and forced into the dirt. They strip the SS officers of their dignity just as quickly as they strip the prisoners of their lives. As Wicker is dragged away, shouting about the Geneva Convention, the soldiers watching feel a dark consensus forming. They realize that a trial is too good for men like this. A courtroom is too civilized. The soldiers grip their weapons tighter. They are moving into the heart of the camp now, toward a place called the coal yard. The rage that began at the train station has now been focused, sharpened, and loaded into the chamber. The fuse has been lit, and the explosion is seconds away. The spark that finally ignites the powder keg is struck in a secluded area of the camp known as the coal yard. Here, a group of about 50 SS guards has been rounded up. These are the men who didn't flee. They were captured hiding in barracks, pulling off their uniforms, or trying to blend in. Now, they are herded together and marched toward a long, brick masonry wall that runs along the edge of the yard. The atmosphere is suffocating. The air is thick with coal dust, and the lingering stench of the crematoriums located just a few hundred yards away. And that detail is crucial. Before reaching this wall, many of the American soldiers had passed by the ovens. They had seen the piles of clothes. They had seen the human bones that were still smoldering inside the furnaces. The heat of the genocide was literally still radiating from the brickwork. So, when Lieutenant Jack Bushyhead, a Native American officer from Oklahoma, looks at the men lined up against the wall, he isn't seeing prisoners of war. He is seeing the monsters who shoveled people into those ovens. Bushyhead is a Cherokee. He comes from a people who know the history of displacement and suffering. But today, he is the tip of the spear for the US Army. He stands there, his Thompson submachine gun resting in his hands, his knuckles white. He is shaking, not from fear, but from an adrenaline overdose caused by rage. The Germans, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, begin to panic. They realize that the gentleman's agreement of surrender isn't holding. Desperate to save themselves, a few of them throw their hands up and start chanting the only phrase they think might work. Hitler kaput! Hitler kaput! Hitler is finished. They think this magic phrase will absolve them. They think that by denouncing their leader at the last possible second, they can wash the blood off their hands. But to the Americans watching, this display is the final insult. It is cowardly. It is pathetic. It confirms that these men have no honor. They were willing to be mass murderers when they were winning, but the moment the tables turned, they became sniveling cowards. A heavy machine gunner, a soldier nicknamed Bird Eye, sets up his .30 caliber machine gun on a tripod facing the wall. The metallic clack-clack of the bolt being pulled back echoes through the yard. There is no formal order given. No judge reads a verdict. No jury deliberates. History is still hazy on exactly what happened next. Whether a German moved, whether someone shouted, or whether the tension simply snapped like a dry twig. But Lieutenant Bushyhead doesn't stop it. He looks at his men, looks at the Germans, and the dam breaks. Fire. The air erupts. The sound is deafening, a mixture of the heavy, rhythmic thumping of the machine gun and the rapid chatter of rifles and Thompsons. It is a wall of lead. The shooting lasts for perhaps 10 or 15 seconds, but in the warped time perception of combat, it must have felt like an eternity. The SS guards against the wall dance the macabre jig of death as bullets tear through them. They crumple into a heap at the base of the wall. The chanting of Hitler kaput is replaced by screams, and then by silence. When the smoke clears, the snow and the black coal dust are stained a bright, violent red. Most of the 50 men are dead. Others are twitching in the dirt. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, the commander, hears the roar of the machine gun and comes running from the center of the camp. He sprints into the coal yard, seeing his men preparing to fire again into the pile of bodies. "Stop it!" Sparks screams, pulling out his service pistol and firing it into the air to break the trance. "What the hell are you doing?" The machine gunner, Bird Eye, looks up at the colonel. His face is streaked with tears. He isn't acting like a cold-blooded killer. He is hysterical. He is a 19-year-old boy whose mind has been shattered by what he saw in the boxcars. "Colonel," he sobs, pointing at the dead SS men. "They tried to get away. It is a lie, and they both know it. They didn't try to get away. They were executed." But in that moment, looking at the crying soldier, Sparks realizes the terrifying truth of Dachau. These men haven't just killed prisoners. They have executed the architects of the death train. The rules of civilization have been suspended. The Americans have snapped. And they aren't the only ones. While the gunfire at the coal yard was echoing off the camp walls, a different kind of violence was erupting in the main compound. If the American reaction was a snap of military discipline, what happened next among the prisoners was a primal scream of 30,000 souls released from hell. The electrified barbed wire fences, which had defined the boundaries of their existence for years, were finally breached, and out of the barracks poured a tide of humanity that defied medical explanation. These were men who, by all biological rights, should have been dead. They were walking skeletons, their skin translucent, their legs no thicker than broomsticks. They were starving, typhus-ridden, and weak, but in this moment, they were fueled by a drug more potent than any ration. pure, unadulterated vengeance. They didn't have Thompson submachine guns or M1 Garands. They grabbed shovels used for digging graves. They picked up heavy sticks, rocks, and metal pipes. Some used their bare hands, hands that were nothing more than bone and tendon. They swarmed over the grounds, hunting for anyone wearing an SS uniform. In one instance, a German guard was spotted trying to hide near a watchtower. He was quickly surrounded. The prisoners didn't just attack him, they tore at him. The rage was absolute. It was the release of years of torture, years of watching their families burn, years of being treated like vermin. They dragged the guard to the ground and beat him with a ferocity that stunned the American onlookers. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable. This is where the liberator narrative gets complicated. American soldiers stood by and watched. In some cases, they leaned against jeeps, lighting cigarettes, observing the carnage with a detached, cold interest. When a young private asked his sergeant if they should intervene, if they should stop the prisoners from beating a man to death, the sergeant reportedly shook his head. "No," he said. "Let them finish. They've earned this." There are even accounts, verified by veterans years later, of American GIs tossing their own bayonets or pistols into the crowd of prisoners, essentially handing them the tools to finish the job. After seeing the death train, the Americans felt they had no moral authority to deny these victims their retribution. They became spectators in a coliseum of revenge. But the prisoners' wrath wasn't reserved solely for the SS. There was another target, a group arguably hated even more than the Germans: the Kapos. The Kapos were prisoners themselves, often violent criminals or political dissidents who had been recruited by the SS to police their fellow inmates. In exchange for extra food, better clothes, and the chance to survive, the Kapos became the camp's enforcers. They beat their own people. They selected their own people for the gas chambers. To the average prisoner, the Capo was the ultimate traitor, a Judas who had sold his soul for a loaf of bread. Now, with the SS gone, the Kapos were left unprotected. The reckoning was medieval. In one horrifying scene, a group of prisoners cornered a notorious Capo near the camp latrines. They didn't shoot him. They didn't hang him. They dragged him to the open waste pit and shoved him in. As he struggled to climb out, screaming for mercy, they pushed him back down with poles and shovels. They held him under the filth until the bubbles stopped rising. For one terrifying hour, Dachau ceased to be a military operation. It became a lawless zone where the hierarchy of predator and prey was violently inverted. The victims became the judges, the juries, and the executioners. Eventually, the madness has to end. The frenzy of killing burns itself out, replaced by the cold reality of military discipline. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, realizing that his men are on the verge of losing their souls alongside their enemies, takes decisive action. He rushes back into the chaos, firing his service pistol into the air, the sharp cracks cutting through the noise of the mob. He physically shoves soldiers away from the prisoners, ordering them to lock down the remaining German guards. Order is restored, but the secret cannot be contained. In the days following the liberation, the adrenaline fades, and the magnitude of what happened begins to sink in. Photos have been taken. Graphic, undeniable black and white photographs of American soldiers standing over piles of executed Germans in the coal yard. The US Army, concerned about the political fallout, launches an immediate investigation. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Whitaker leads the inquiry. He interviews the soldiers. He collects the testimony. He compiles the photographs. His final report is damning. It concludes that the men of the 45th Infantry Division violated international law. It recommends courts-martial for the officers involved, including Lieutenant Bushyhead and Colonel Sparks. It recommends that the heroes of Dachau be treated as criminals. The report moves up the chain of command until it lands on the desk of the most feared and revered man in the European theatre, General George S. Patton. Patton is a strict disciplinarian. He is a man who once slapped a soldier for having shell shock. He fines men for unpolished boots. But when he picks up the Whitaker report, he doesn't just read the legal jargon. He looks at the attached photographs. He looks at the pictures of the executed SS guards. Then, he looks at the pictures of the death train. He stares at the images of the starving children, the skeletal corpses, the evidence of a crime so vast it defies human language. Patton realizes that the law was written for wars between men, not for a war against monsters. He reportedly looks at his staff and dismisses the investigation with a wave of his hand. Hell no, Patton effectively decides. These men were overwrought. They had nervous trigger fingers. It happens in war. In a legendary act of command, Patton refuses to sign the court-martial papers. Depending on which historical account you believe, he either tore the report up, burned it, or ordered it buried in the deepest, most top-secret clearance file in the army archives. His logic is simple and brutal. The SS got exactly what they deserved. He will not destroy the lives of American heroes for killing the architects of hell. The charges are dropped. The investigation is quashed. Lieutenant Jack Bushyhead, the man who gave the silent order at the wall, returns home to Oklahoma. He never faces a trial. He melts back into civilian life, becoming a quiet, respected member of the Cherokee Nation. He never speaks publicly about that day in the coal yard. He takes the memory of the smell, the screams, and the gunfire to his grave when he dies in 1977. Today, if you visit the Dachau Memorial Site, you will see monuments honoring the 30,000 victims who suffered and died there. You will see the preserved barracks and the crematoriums, but you will not find a monument for the 50 SS guards who died against the wall. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves, unmourned and largely forgotten. History has rendered its verdict. They were the devil, and on April 29, 1945, they met their match. But the story of the Dachau reprisals leaves us with a haunting legacy. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the line between a hero and a killer is thinner than we like to admit. It reminds us that there is a breaking point for every human being. So, we return to where we started. Picture yourself back on that railroad track. The air is cold. The smell of death is choking you. You have just looked inside a cattle car and seen a child who starved to death over 21 days. You turn around and you see the man responsible for it, standing there in a clean uniform, smiling, asking for your respect. Be honest with yourself. In that moment, with a rifle in your hand, would you remain a professional soldier, or would you become an avenger? Thanks for watching. If you want to uncover more secrets of World War II that didn't make it into the history books, click the video on the screen right now.